Hi class, this is Tabio, and this is my week 6 discussion board response. In this video, I'd like to share with you my opinion about the Child Maltreatment Index. I believe that the purpose of this index is to guide consistent and accurate decision making by both the Florida Abuse Hotline counselors and field investigation staff. The Child Maltreatment Index provides a pretty good layout of the standards of each specific maltreatment, the definition, and the factors to consider in the assessment of each maltreatment. It also provides a list of questions, which helps the counselors and field investigation staff to either factor or exclude certain factors in making the right decision in terms of which appropriate maltreatment applies to each case. Pretty much, I understand that the index applies to all reports received at the hotline and all child protective investigations that are conducted under Chapter 39 of the Florida statutes. As I review the case of Phoebe Jonchuck, there are several strengths and weaknesses in relation to the Child Maltreatment Index. The weakness would be that the index doesn't really provide a lot of specifics. It's to the it can seem on the broad scale if you're trying to find out in the case of abuse with a child. And even in this case, I can understand where the counselor erred because she just wasn't sure what appropriate maltreatment to apply to this case. So I think it doesn't provide a lot of specifics, so that would be one weakness. The strengths of the index is that it provides a really nice guide. Even though the claims is that it's an accurate decision making, I think will be times when there is a gray area for those who have to pretty much define in case by case which one is the appropriate maltreatment to apply. In relation to the case of Phoebe Jonchuck, I want to go back to the call that took place on January 7, 2015 to the hotline, where Mr. Jonchuck had made multiple statements to the caller earlier that morning that sounded delusional and caused the caller to be alarmed. Now, looking over the case, it does appear that Mr. Jonchuck had a history of mental health, mental issues. So in this particular call on January 7th, the caller indicated that they had already made a 911 call, but the law enforcement personnel had determined that Mr. Jonchuck Jr. did not meet the criteria for involuntary hospitalization. So pretty much this call was screened out. In an interview with the CIRRT, the hotline counselor stated that she had placed the call on hold to review the policy and protocol and review prior history. So the counselor also made mention that she had identified the potential maltreatment as inadequate supervision, but concluded that the criteria to accept the call were not met. So she indicated that she understood that the caller was concerned about Mr. Jonchuck Jr.'s state of mind, but also noted that the caller was unable to describe concerns that the child might be harmed. So pretty much excuse me, the counselor did not see an immediate need um, for this child to be removed from the home. The the caller did not come to the conclusion that the child was at risk for threatened harm. There was any potential of harm, immediate harm. Um, so these are conclusions that I believe that the caller made. Um, sorry, the counselor, um, the hotline counselor made in regards to the call that was made. In the call, she stated that the fact that Phoebe was reported to be with her stepmother and not with Mr. Jonchuck Jr. at the time of the call led her to conclude that the child was not in danger. So that's another reason why she came to that conclusion. So there was no immediate danger at the time of the call because uh, the child was not under the supervision of Mr. Jonchuck at that time. So though the caller had stated that there was a current investigation which was accurate, the counselor indicated in her interview that she had been unable to locate an open report. The counselor failed in this decision, where when she could not locate the report, she did not consult with the supervisor. So I believe that had the counselor did a little bit more due diligence, had been a lot more thorough, the death of Phoebe could have been prevented. It was a very tragic death, but I think that just being a little bit more diligent and just being more proactive in the investigation of trying to just garner as much about Mr. Jonchuck, and there's a strong possibility that the death of Phoebe could have been prevented. So in relation to this case, the child maltreatment index, it lacked clarity at the time of the call regarding the impact of mental health issues, which Mr. Jonchuck obviously had based on his history and his ability as a parent to provide adequate supervision. This contributed strongly to the counselor reaching the conclusion that Phoebe was not in danger. The counselor also appears to have placed too much value on the fact that the child was with the stepmother. And as I mentioned, that I believe that played a major factor in the decision making. You know, this child doesn't appear to be in immediate danger because he's not in the care. She's not under the supervision, of Mr. Jonchuck. And it did not happen at the time of the call, but that does not mean that that the child still did not at any point in time prior to the call or even after the call was under the supervision and care of Mr. Jonchuck. The counselor's relative inexperience, the limiting descriptions in the maltreatment index at the time, and the general lack of mental health specific training provided for hotline counselors were all contributing factors in the failure to accept this call. So these are also some weaknesses in the child maltreatment index, the limiting descriptions. And this goes back to what I mentioned earlier, that the index doesn't really provide a whole lot of specifics. I think it really relies on good judgment on the side of the counselor to make in regards to each case. But personally, for me, when a child is involved, you know, it's important to know all the specifics, and I think had this counselor received more training in regards to mental health, and specific training where mental health is concerned, I believe that possibly the outcome of Phoebe would have been differently and hopefully favorably um, instead of tragically. The changes that had already been made to the index will help to provide more effective guidance for future situations that include individuals with presenting mental health symptoms. So based on my knowledge and my experience with those people who have mental health symptoms and mental health history, they're known to be um, unstable emotionally, mentally, and there are signs, there are symptoms, and sometimes these individuals they're in a state of denial about their state of mental health, but they need to be under close watch and close physician care because you just never know when they're going to just snap. And in this case, I believe there were possibly a number of symptoms, a number of events, that kind of just was like a boiling point for Mr. Jonchuck, and to the point where he threw Phoebe, the 5-year-old, over a bridge. So as a result of the changes and how it will affect the case, the instructions in the new protocol are as follows. All calls to the Florida Abuse Hotline that are accepted as reports alleging inadequate supervision when a caregiver is present shall be coded as an immediate response priority, which I think is a major change. In the event that someone else does call in similar to Mr. Jonchuck and there is a history of mental health symptoms, then this case will be treated with the highest priority, especially if there's a child involved. So in addition, the hotline will transfer the call to the appropriate law enforcement agency and request a well-being check of the child, which is, again, this is like a major improvement to the instructions and the protocol that was in place before. So with the call being treated with the highest priority, especially when the circumstances present are significant, clearly observable, and actively occurring, I believe, just being proactive and, really, because essentially the bottom line is for the child to be safe. So being proactive and, and getting law enforcement involved, getting child protective services involved, and all the child services team involved in this case will only be favorable to the well-being of the child. The changes to the maltreatment index also include, in addition to the definition portion of the index that states this maltreatment would also apply when a parent or caregiver is present but has a history or is currently exhibiting signs of mental health issues, delusional behavior, immaturity, development delays, or other limitations that have resulted in harm or pose a threat of harm to the child. And these are symptoms of persons with mental health issues, delusional behavior, developmental delays, As I said, sometimes their behavior is unpredictable. Um, and they can really act to the extreme in situations and in circumstances that don't necessitate that type of behavior. Two additions to the examples portions of the index. A caregiver whose mental health issues have caused them to not attend to a child's daily needs, and a caregiver who's exhibiting serious signs of mental health issues or cognitive delays while acting as a caregiver. So these are all really um, positive, and I think they're great additions to the index, um, or the examples to that portion of the index that talks about inadequate supervision. Um, so a list of 7 new screening questions, which is also very important. Um, Initially, when I started this video, I mentioned about the questions. So as a hotline counselor is um, doing an intake on the call and the nature of the call, there are certain screening questions that help them to determine what appropriate action to take with this particular call. So with the new screening questions that must be asked by a hotline counselor, excuse me, or child protective investigator who is assisting a caregiver whose mental health issues may be impacting their capacity to provide care. They also include a list of common symptoms with descriptions and Florida Department of Children and Families Critical Incident Rapid Response Team report. So I believe now that these questions that have been designed will in a great way help to determine whether the symptoms contribute, or I'm sorry, whether the symptoms constitute a threat to the child. So in response to this tragedy, they did make these changes. They made an effective date of January the 9th, Friday, January the 9th, and the department updated the inadequate supervision portion of the official maltreatment index to allow for the presence of obvious mental health symptoms to be more easily categorized as problematic and therefore accepted. And I believe that moving forward, it's just unfortunate in this case with Phoebe, the way that she died and the circumstances leading up to her death. But I believe that these are opportunities for learning opportunities. These are learning curves. It's unfortunate that it's learned from a death of a child, because that's the last thing that we want, is for a child to die and then for us to take action to say, okay, well, this child died and we don't want another incident or a repeat of such an incident. So in that case, we will make the necessary revisions, we'll make the necessary additions and updating of the protocols and the policies that we have in place. So I think this is just a really tragic reminder for us as child services, as social workers who are part of the child services team, that that in a case of inadequate supervision, not to rule out anything, especially when there's a history of mental health with any of the caregivers. Um, it's definitely as a result, as even in relation to this case, that it's a sign that immediate action needs to be taken. We need to be proactive in trying to ensure um, the um, safety of the child and the well-being of the child. Thank you for listening to my week 6 discussion board response.